data sourcing is making data. And specifically, we're talking about getting new data. I like to think of this as you're getting your hands on and you're getting data de novo, new data. So can't find the data that you need for your analysis? Well, one simple solution is do it yourself. And we're going to talk about a few general strategies used for doing that. Now, these strategies vary on a few dimensions. First off is the role. Are you passive and simply observing stuff that's happening already? Or are you active where you play a role in creating the situation to get the data? And then there's the QQ question, and that is, are you going to get quantitative or numerical data? Or are you going to get qualitative data, which usually means text, paragraphs, sentences, as well as things like photos and videos and audio? And also, how are you going to get the data? Do you want to get it online or do you want to get it in person? Now, there's other choices than these, but these are some of the big delineators of the different methods. When you look at those, you get a few possible options. Number one is interviews, and I'll say more about those. Another one is surveys. A third one is card sorting. And the fourth one is experiments, although I actually want to split experiments into two kinds of categories. The first one is laboratory experiments, and that's in-person projects where you shape the information or an experience for the participants as a way of seeing how that involvement changes their reactions. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're a participant, but you create the situation. And then there's also A/B testing. This is automated online testing of two or more variations on a web page. It's a very, very simple kind of experimentation that's actually very useful for optimizing websites. So, in sum, from this very short introduction, make sure you can get exactly what you need. Get the data you need to answer your question. And if you can't find it somewhere, then make it. And as always, you have many possible methods, each of which have their own strengths and their own compromises. And we'll talk about each of those in the following sections. The first method of data sourcing where you're making new data that I want to talk about is interviews. And that's not because it's the most common, but because it's the one you would do for the most basic problem. Now, basically, an interview is nothing more than a conversation with another person or a group of people. And the fundamental question is, why do interviews as opposed to doing a survey or something else? Well, there's a few good reasons to do that. Number one, you're working with a new topic and you don't know what people's responses will be or how they'll react. And so you need something very open-ended. Number two, you're working with a new audience. You don't know how they will react in particular to what it is you're trying to do. And number three, something's going on with the current situation. It's not working anymore, and you need to find what's going on, and you need to find ways to improve. The open-ended information where you get past your existing categories and boundaries can be one of the most useful methods for getting that data. If you want to put it another way, you want to do interviews when you don't want to constrain responses. Now, when it comes to interviews, you have one very basic choice, and that's whether you do a structured interview. And with a structured interview, you have a predetermined set of questions, and everyone gets the same questions in the same order. It gives a lot of consistency, even though the responses are open-ended. And then you can also have what's called an unstructured interview. And this is a whole lot more like a conversation where you as the interviewer and the person you're talking to, your questions arise in response to their answers. Consequently, an unstructured interview can be different for each person that you talk to. Also, interviews are usually done in person, but not surprisingly, they can be done over the phone or often online. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind about interviews. Number one is time. Interviews can range from just a few minutes to several hours per person. Second is training. Interviewing is a special skill that usually requires specific training. Now, asking the questions is not necessarily the hard part. The really tricky part is the analysis. The hardest part of interviews by far is analyzing the answers for themes and way of extracting the new categories and the dimensions that you need for your further research. The beautiful thing about interviews is they allow you to learn things that you never expected. So in sum, interviews are best for new situations or new audiences. On the other hand, they can be time consuming And they also require special training, both to conduct the interview, but even more to analyze the highly qualitative data that you get from them. An interesting topic in data sourcing when you're making data is card sorting. Now, this isn't something that comes up very often in academic research, but in web research, this can be a really important method. Think of it as what you're trying to do is like building a model of a molecule here. You're trying to build a mental model or a model of people's mental structures. Put more specifically, how do people organize information intuitively? And also, how does that relate to the things that you're doing online? Now, the basic procedure goes like this. You take a bunch of little topics and you write each one on a separate card. And you can do this physically with like 3x5 cards, or there's a lot of programs that allow you to do a digital version of it. Then what you do is you give this information to a group of respondents and the people sort those cards. So they put similar topics with each other, different topics over here, and so on. And then you take that information, and from that, you're able to calculate what's called dissimilarity data. Think of it as like the distance or the difference between various topics. And that gives you the raw data to analyze how things are structured. Now, there are two very general kinds of card sorting tasks. There are generative and there's evaluative. A generative card sorting task is one in which respondents create their own sets, their own piles of cards using any number of groupings they like. And this might be used, for instance, to design a website. If people are going to be looking for one kind of information next to another one, then you want to put that together on the website so they know where to expect it. On the other hand, if you've already created a website, then you can do an evaluative card sorting. This is where you have a fixed number or fixed names of categories, like for instance, the way you've set up your menus already. And then what you do is you see if people naturally put the cards into these various categories that you've created. That's a way of verifying that your hierarchical structure makes sense to people. Now, whichever method you do, generative or evaluative, what you end up with when you do a card structure is an interesting kind of visualization. It's called a dendrogram. That actually means branches. And what we have here is actually 150 data points. If you're familiar with Fisher's iris data, that's what's going on here. And it groups it from one giant group on the left and then splits it in pieces and pieces and pieces until you end up with lots of different individual level observations at the end. But you can cut things off into 2 or 3 groups or wherever it's most useful for you here as a way of visualizing the entire collection of similarity or dissimilarity between the individual pieces of information that you had people sort. Now, I'll just mention very quickly, if you want to do digital card sorting, which makes your life infinitely easier because keeping track of physical cards is really hard, you can use something like Optimal Workshop or UserZoom or UX Suite. These are some of the most common choices. Now, let's just sum up what we've learned about card sorting in this extremely brief overview. Number one, card sorting allows you to see intuitive organization of information in a hierarchical format. You can do it with physical cards, or you also have digital choices for doing the same thing. And when you're done, you actually get this hierarchical or branched visualization of how the information is structured and related to each other.